Gurupudi Pandit Ji, my friend Amitabh, Mattoo, Sri Chakravarti, Dr. Vashisht, Dr. Soni, faculty members, students, and other invitees. Let me start by congratulating SIS as it celebrates its 70th anniversary. Since its inception in 1955, the School of International Studies at JNU has been a leading light in formulating and disseminating a uniquely Indian perspective on international relations and developments in the world. I've had a long association with many of those scholars and others who have made this institution what it is. That film that you showed prior to the commencement of the session brought back memories of many at whose feet one has learnt, with whom one has associated, and from that association one has gained. Today, as we meet on the 70th anniversary of this great institution, let me reflect, and I should say introspect, on some of the changes in the world that have characterized these 70 years. Obviously, I do not have the time, so I'll just fast forward to providing you a snapshot of what I think is happening today. When this great institution was born, I was 3 years old. And in the 70 years that have lapsed, I think one thing that is very clear is that the global order today is at an inflection point. The certainties that shaped the post-1945 world, particularly the dominance of the Western liberal order and the logic of open markets, those are being challenged as never before. The UN, with which I've had the privilege of a long association, and which once presented itself as the moral arbiter of peace and justice, now appears at the very least to be paralyzed. The UN Security Council mirrors a world that no longer reflects ground realities. Reform has been reduced to ritual incantation. The voice of 140 plus developing countries is at best muted. The theme that we are discussing today, Reimagining the Global South, could not have come at a more appropriate time. Across the world, technology, demography, geopolitics are reshaping power equations. The developing world, and if you include countries like India in that, once seen as the periphery of decision making, now many of us find ourselves at the center of growth, ideas and innovation. The Global South, once defined by its struggles, I would venture to say, could increasingly be defined in terms of the immense possibilities and the potential that it could exploit. And these changes that are taking place today don't point in the direction of what the world will be like 5 to 10 years from now. Why do I say this? I've had 39 years in the Foreign Service. I spent 4 years in an international think tank, and this is my 9th year as a member of the Council of Ministers in the Prime Minister's team. And I can say that the changes are taking place at a pace that we still need to not only take stock of those changes, but where there is the power of ideas, as I believe in this institution, you should also help in formulate and shape the events that are taking place and point in the direction of sensible outcomes. Whenever we talk about the South, it's very tempting to talk about North-South and lament all that the North has not done for us, or the failed commitments in the area of climate finance or elsewhere. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. When you deal with the South, and if you deal with the South-South, for instance, We have a representative of the RIS here. I have had the privilege of chairing RIS for some time. South-South presents many potentialities, but I think whichever way we choose to view this subject, which is the theme of your conference for 3 days, I think the least we can do is to be clinically objective and ensure that our discourse is not anchored in sentimentalism or romanticism. Maybe I'm using words which are readily coming to my mind, but whenever I find myself in the company of young minds, I recall my own 5 years in Delhi University as a student of history, then on the teaching faculty of St. Stephen's College, and in many respects those were the happiest years of my life. Not that the other years have been unhappy, but happier because you tend to gain very much more when you are in the company of those who are thinking full time. I'm not saying others are not, but I think the beauty of universities is that you are thinking more than those who have, who've got the responsibility of the weight of responsibility in terms of governance or other things. There's something that I liked, and I like a lot of things that Amitabh says. He said we should not just interpret the past, but did you refer to politicians in saying that? You did, no? No, I agree with him. Because I know he did, but when I wrote that quote down, I said, he said, hope politicians will not just reinterpret the world. So I put a parenthesis around it. No, but I'm reminded from my readings, and let me start by saying that, if you look at Western political philosophy, it's essentially a range between David Hume on the right and Karl Marx on the left, by and large. And I always recall, it's one of my favorite starting points in a lecture like this, what Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire to Louis Napoleon wrote. He said, Hegel once famously said that history repeats itself. And then Marx goes on to add, not what Hegel had written, but what he said. He said he should have added, that is, Hegel should have added, first time as tragedy and second time as farce. So I was very happy when Amitabh sought to take a slight, nudge at politicians. And since I've willy-nilly moved into that category from starting life as an student, academic, a professional diplomat, think tanker, do tanker, and now in the world of politics, you're absolutely right. The world that we inhabit today, it has to change drastically in order to deliver welfare and what is required by the citizenry. Let me just briefly go through what I think speaks to the strength of the Global South. What is wrong with the current world? I don't need to go into that. All of you, now you don't even need to, work too hard. You have instant news coming at you in terms of all that could potentially go wrong, and you can have that documented. To begin with, the post-war order, as I said, the order which was established in 1945, starting with the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations was conceptualized and given birth to. Then the Bretton Woods institutions, the fund and the bank, which were, the result of a conference which took place in a sleepy New Hampshire village, where it was an intellectual contest really between, two giants of the time, John Maynard Keynes and the American Finance Secretary, Mr. White. And then the Havana Charter, which was stillborn because the legislature of an important country did not want to ratify an agreement which would take legislative authority away from its own legislature. And they therefore ratified Chapter 4, which dealt with tariffs and trade, and that got converted into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and given legal basis through the ICITO or the Interim Committee on International Trade Organization. That order, I think, served the international community, the world order, and it underpinned the multilateral system rather well. I mean, if you look at post-war reconstruction of Europe, if you look at what happened to the other countries involved, but that was a system essentially anchored in the rule of law and multilateral. We can take exception. We can say that as junior partners, we were at the receiving end of the rule of law. It didn't always work to our advantage. Possibly true, but it was still based in a rule of law. I'm an old trade negotiator. I mean, old means old by age, but many years of experience. I can tell you that whenever developing countries had a competitive advantage in any field of trade, like in textiles and clothing, well, lo and behold, they came around and said, textiles and clothing has to be taken away from the free trade rules of the GATT through a derogation called the multi-fiber arrangement. Why? Because, you know, there are temporary problems and they have to, and lo and behold, textiles and clothing, one sector in which the developing countries were competitive, was taken out of the free trade rules and so on. So that has been a pattern that the global south was at the receiving end. I mean, I have no doubt on that. But I'm not trying to rationalize what is happening, but is that better that you have a rule of law where you at least have recourse? If you take away somebody's tariff preferences, you have at least to, pay compensation under Article 28 of the GATT, or something where you decide you want to do it in any case and you go ahead and do it. In which case you are into a world of total uncertainty, as I think many of you have been saying. I'm not getting into value judgment, and I'm not treading into on the toes and territory of my colleagues who are doing the trade negotiations, but I'm merely pointing at the systemic issues that we are dealing with. Today, 80% of the world's population, most of its natural resources, and the fastest growing markets are in the global south. This is a fact of life. The World Bank's latest data puts GDP per capita for low and middle income economies at about US dollars 5,975 current for 2024, a fraction of advanced economies. Roughly 72% of people in extreme poverty live in IDA eligible countries, almost all in the global south. Demography remains a double-edged sword. Global fertility has fallen to around 2.3 births per woman, according to the UNFPA, but the global south fertility rate is higher at around 2.6. Now, I said if you want to discuss the global south, you have the very easy temptation of looking at the global south in north-south terms, and then you can have a lament. Pledges of US dollars 100 billion in annual climate finance have remained unfulfilled. The SDGs, if you exclude India and you exclude one or two other success stories, are not doing as well as they had anticipated or had been anticipated. When I was ambassador and permanent representative of India to the UN in New York, we were finishing the MDGs. I always found fault with the MDGs because I said their entire conceptualization and structure has been worked out in the think tank of the OECD, of the West, that is the OECD, and we were given a set of prescription. You do this, you do that, etc. Well, the MDGs did well, largely on account of the fact that one, developing countries, if you choose to call it like that, China did extremely well. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and with a little help from countries like India, Nigeria, South Africa, etc. But when you come to the SDGs will do well because India will do well. When the SDGs were conceptualized, I think they came into being around 2016-17. But meanwhile, Mr. Modi had arrived in India in May 2014. And as the Vice Chancellor was saying, in many ways, the Modi program predates and anticipated the SDGs. For instance, the economy jumping from $2 trillion in 2014 to $4.3 trillion now is just the overall set of figures. You also factor how many, you lifted 270 million people out of multidimensional poverty during this period of time. I was Housing and Urban Affairs Minister for 7 years. If I share with you those statistics, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, that is affordable housing, under 4 verticals, given to 4 crore people with a decision to give it to another 3 crore. Our urban transport system, which was virtually not there, I mean the metro system, it was started in Mr. Vajpayee's time when we had about 212 kilometers overall in the country. Today we've reached a stage where we have about 980 kilometers of metro lines functioning and another 1,000 kilometers under construction, which means that in effect, in a few months' time, if not, or maybe a little later, India will have the world's 3rd largest metro system. China, no, in fact, the 2nd largest. We will overtake the United States, which has 1,560. We've already, I think, overtaken Japan and Korea. You look at it anywhere, any area. I don't want to talk about digital inclusion, all those other things. I think the story is showing what a rapidly successful economy like India can do. When you come to climate indices, India is the only G20 country which has met its Paris commitments. I want to now come briefly to what India has done in the South-South context. I mean, I just want to touch on a few areas. You know, the Prime Minister had, during the G20 presidency, convened a group called the Voice of the Global South, which convened over 120 developing countries to articulate and share priorities from food to energy security. Our vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, I think this needs to be cited, supplied made in India vaccines to over 90 countries, contrasting sharply with the hoarding tendencies of the developed world. Indian DPI is being studied and replicated across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Let me just recall what the challenge was at that point of time. India had a domestic vaccine manufacturing capability. It was exclusively in the public sector, and around the year 2010, for a variety of reasons, that public sector vaccine manufacturing was dismantled. So when we had to face the pandemic towards the end of 2019 or 20, not many people realized the enormity or the gravity of this pandemic. We had faced pandemics earlier. When I was accredited to the World Health Organization in Geneva, we had faced SARS, swine flu, Ebola, etc. And we were in a happy situation thinking we'll manage. But we didn't realize this was like the Spanish flu of 2019, which was in a completely different kind, and millions of people had died. So we produced an indigenous domestic manufacturing capability for vaccines, plus one of our entities in Pune teamed up with Oxford Research and I remember AstraZeneca, and we not only produced, manufactured and distributed 220 crore, but as I mentioned, to 90 is, I think, South-South at its best. Well, I think if you look at what else we have been able to do, people-centric cooperation, I think there are many examples of that. We have gone from aid to co-creation towards joint problem-solving and development rather than aid and grants, regional production networks and green industrial corridors. I can tell you that in many of the areas I deal with now, particularly energy security, one can say with a lot of confidence that what we have done with Brazil in terms of biofuel and what we are doing with other countries, digital public goods as new connective tissue, finance and debt reform as enablers of sovereignty, championing reform of global governance, and all said and done, I think both on the South-South thing, we have through our own policies shown what a developing country can do. I have serious difficulties when we use terms like developing because, you know, when the developing countries decide to go in for collective action, we formed a group of 77, and then the group of 77 decided to become group of 77 plus China. Now China is what, a $20 trillion economy, and if the group of 77 ends up taking positions which are not medium term or long term in terms of the conducive to the growth of the developing South, but there is interest everywhere. There is self-interest and there is economic vested interest, and I just feel that we have to ultimately face a very basic question. Does the Global South need the multilateral system? I think yes, because I think the multilateral system, if it is anchored in a rule of law, with all its faults, is always helpful. Do the strong and the dominant voices need the multilateral system? I think they do. Is there morality in international relations and decision making? I think there should be. But if you were to look at individual examples and see if there is morality, and my favorite example which I want to share with you today is about what one country in the Global South was doing to its own people. I go back to 1971, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. But in 1971, the Consul General of the United States in Dhaka, his name was Archer Blood, and the Secretary of State was a man called Henry Kissinger. Now, Kissinger is a very big name in international relations. I knew Henry very well. I used to periodically have lunch with him. I've hosted him. I've been to his place, had been to his place. And what happened in Bangladesh, or what became Bangladesh later, I just want to read out to you what something called the dissent telegram. And I know many of you are familiar with this. About a dozen, let me start right at the beginning just to encapsulate. This is chapter 5 of the Blood telegram. He start saying, both Richard Nixon and Archer Blood was the Consul General, were keenly aware of a disquieting fact. Pakistan's military, now at war with its own people, had been heavily armed by the United States. And then starts the process of genocide.
Right.
It starts. Now I want to fast forward to page 75 in this of the Blood telegram chapter. After a dozen harrowing days, Blood's officers had had enough of standard Washington procedure, because here was genocide unfolding in front of your own eyes, and the young officers of the US Foreign Service posted in Dhaka were sending the signals, saying that this is what is happening here. American arms are being used to crush democracy. And Scott Butcher, the young political officer, and some other officials talked about a complete indictment of Nixon and Kissinger's policy. They wanted to send a dissent cable, a new device in the Foreign Service, a Vietnam-sparked reform meant to encourage candor by allowing diplomats to speak out confidentially against official policy. This was at the height of the Vietnam War, says Butcher. We're out at Camp Swanee, totally out of touch. No one is listening to us. There were many voices during the Vietnam War as well. But when you go forward, finally I want to just say 2 weeks into the slaughter, Blood transmitted his consulate's vehement dissent. First young officers drafted a telegram, sent it around for signature. They were not sure whether the Consul General Archer Blood would actually buy the text. Many people to whom the draft text went, they started tightening it, etc. And finally this issued. The telegram detonated in all directions to diplomats in Washington, Islamabad, Karachi and Lahore. The confidential cable with the blunt subject line, dissent from US policy towards East Pakistan, was probably the most blistering denunciation of US foreign policy ever seen by its diplomats. And then if you read that, they say that the conviction that US policy related to recent developments in East Pakistan serves neither our moral interests broadly defined nor our national interests narrowly defined, numerous officers, and then went on to say what all is wrong. I just want to conclude with this to say, in the real world, and this is where I seek a nuanced, distancing from academics. I mean, I could have become an academic, but I spent 39 years in the Foreign Service. So, in the real world, it is always possible, although it sounds bizarre, that somebody commits genocide and then gets the Nobel Peace Prize. It happens.
Right.
But in the real world, that still doesn't take away the imperative need to take hard decision making. But there is one thing that distinguishes India, and this is where I want to conclude, that we are not just a country which is an independent country forms born in 1947, but we have a civilizational heritage. I don't think at any point in our history we could have done the kind of things that are described, for instance, as an example in this sorry episode. Because I think even where we've had foreign policy pluses and minuses, yes, you went in with good intentions. Sri Lanka is a case in point. I was the political officer there. But after a point of time, there was no thing that now that we are here, we will, we have other aggrandizement or, territorial interests, etc. We went back. So our civilizational component, I think, also prevents us, and it's a constant reminder that our cultural basis, and that is what it is an extra plus that we bring in our conduct of relations with other countries, with groups of countries, and that the India which is evolving today, I have no doubt. I mean, a lot of people are cynics and say 2047, No, I have no doubt about two things. That $4 trillion economy is going to become $6, $8, $10 trillion, and well before 2047, we'll have the GDP there. Now, whether GDP by in and of itself helps in producing what is a developed country, again, there's no definition. But I think the way we are going, we will not only have the other indices in place, but it will be for many a case study in how a country which had a GDP, if you believe in Angus Madison and what he wrote, in 1700 of 25% of global GDP down to 3% after 90 years of colonialism, then it reinvents itself, and in the run-up from now to 2047, it will truly be a developed country. Thank you very much.